Now that we got our expenses list, it's time to work on these list items again. Because of course we got this text here, but the goal later is to not just output some text, not just output the titles of those expenses, but instead to output all the expense information that's relevant. For that, I'll create another new file because I want to create another new widget, which then will be used for these expense items, again, to keep the build method of this expenses list widget relatively lean, since you will see that the expense item widget, which I'm about to create, will actually combine many other widgets again. So for that, I'll add a new file, and since this will be a file with a widget that's closely related to this expenses list, I'll organize my code such that I add a widgets folder, and in that widgets folder, I'll add an expenses list folder, and I'll then move expenses list Dart into this expenses list folder, and in that folder also create an expense underscore item Dart file, which will then be that file that contains the class, the widget class, that will be used for outputting the individual list items in that list. And I'll also move the expenses Dart file into the widgets folder, not into expenses list, but into the widgets folder. So that in the end in my project, I have the main.dart file, and then I have the models folder with expense Dart, and the widgets folder with expenses Dart and expenses list. This expenses list folder with its two widgets. And organizing the code like this is of course totally optional, but it can help with ensuring that your project stays manageable. So here we can now create a new class in this expense item Dart file, and that's the expense item class, which extends stateless widget again. Stateless widget because there won't be any internal data that would need to be managed. And of course here we again need the build method, and we also need a constructor, expense item, because we again need to get some input data here. We need the expense data that should be displayed on the screen. For this, I'll add a new property to the expense item class, which should be of type expense. And of course, for that, you again must add the import to this expense Dart file in the models folder in your project folder, so that I can add my expense property, which is of this type here. And then in this constructor, we can set this to mix things up here with a positional argument, though you could also wrap this into curly braces to turn it into a named argument. Positional arguments by default are always required, hence the required annotation is not needed and not supported here. And we still, of course, also need to add a second accepted parameter, which is a named parameter and hence wrapped between curly braces. And that would be this key parameter, which is then forwarded to the parent class, to the stateless widget class. With that, we can now output our widget, our combination of widgets down here. And here for this expense item, you can of course definitely play around with the different widgets supported by Flutter with the things you will already learned about throughout the course. This is a great exercise, so definitely do that. Here for this widget, I chose to start by wrapping everything with the card widget, which is a widget we haven't seen before. This is a widget which I simply use for styling purposes, because this will give us a nice card look. It will basically put the content that we pass to card into a container that's a bit elevated, that has a slight shadow behind itself to make it stand out a bit more. I can show you how it looks by setting the child parameter, the named child parameter on this card widget, and set this to the text widget. And now here I want to access expense title. This is not the final definition of my expense item, but this allows me to show you how this card widget will look like. So here I output expense title, and now we can use expense item in the expenses list Dart file by going down here and removing this text widget in the item builder function. And instead we want to create our expense item here. If I use this auto suggestion menu here, it again automatically adds the import for me. Otherwise you must add this import manually to your project, the widgets folder, expenses list, and then expense item Dart. And with that added, down here we can create an expense item by instantiating it. And I then want to pass a single expense to it. So I access my list of expenses that I get here. Then use the index again with the square bracket notation to access a single expense. And that's then the value that should be passed as a value to expense item, since there we expect to get an entire expense. And with that, if I force a reload, you now see the titles again, but if you look closely, you see that there is this slight drop shadow. And that's this card look. It doesn't look too amazing here because we got no other styling and no other widgets, but I want to have this elevated look here to make these items stand out at least a little bit. A card also automatically adds some top and bottom margin so that we have some spacing between those items. It's a bit hard to see here, but it's a subtle effect that will make the items look better, especially once we're done adding all the other widgets that should be added here to expense item, which is what I will do next. So here in expense item, we now have this card. As a next step, I want to add some padding to this card. Now, card does not have a padding parameter that could be set. It has a margin parameter with which we could change or extend the default margin that is added anyways, but it doesn't have a padding parameter. And if you recall, padding simply is this internal space, so some spacing which I want to add between the text and the border of this card. Now you can still add padding by refactoring this text widget and wrapping it with the padding widget. This then allows us to set some padding, and here I don't want to add the same padding in all directions. Instead, I'll use the special symmetric constructor function on edge insets, which is this utility class provided by Flutter that's used for creating margins and paddings. And here I want to set my horizontal padding to, let's say, 20, and then my vertical padding to, let's say, 16. And with that, you now see that there is some spacing between the borders of this card widget and the actual content, the text, which already ensures that this looks a bit nicer, I'd argue. Now, of course, that's still not all though. I don't just want to have the text in there. Instead, the goal is to later have the text here in the first row, so to say, and to then have a second row of data inside of that card, which displays us, for example, the amount, but also the date and category. So therefore here, since I want to have two rows, we need the column widget again. And here it's column and not list view because it doesn't need to be scrollable. And list view makes it scrollable by default, but we don't need this here. It's not a long list. And we also don't need that performance optimization because it is a list that's guaranteed to consist of only 2 rows inside of this item. Of course, we might have multiple items, but we are optimizing those by displaying them with list view. Inside of a single item, since we will only have these 2 rows, we don't need that list view. So here we can then set children, and children here should be set to multiple widgets. And the first widget will be the text widget again, which indeed will output the expense title again. We'll change its styling later, but in general, we want to output the title as the first row in this item. But now we're going to add more widgets. I will actually add another row, technically, a third row if you want to call it like this, by using sized box to add some fixed spacing, a fixed height between the text and the actual second row, the actual visible second row, you could say. Instead, we could also use margin wrapped around the first or second row, but this is simply a bit quicker. Now I want to add that actual second row, and that will now actually not just be a single widget, as we have it here in the first row, where it's just the text, but instead it will be the amount, and then to the right of that, it will be a combination of the category, or an icon representing that category, and the date. So therefore here we need the row widget, because that's what we can use if we want to display multiple widgets next to each other horizontally. For that we add children here. And the first child here is now another text widget, which is in general a widget you'll use a lot when building Flutter apps. Because here I want to output the amount that belongs to this expense. For this, we can of course access expense amount like this. However, you see I get an error here because this is actually of type double and the text widget wants a string. Now we can convert it to a string by calling toString, but I will actually call a different method. I will call the toStringAsFixed method, which then wants an argument, which I'll set to 2 here. But what does this do? Well, toStringAsFixed simply ensures that a value like 12.3433 would simply be displayed like this, so that it is limited to 2 digits after the comma. That's what this does. So it's simply a stylistic choice here to make sure that if users would enter amounts with too many decimal places, we only display 2. I actually also want to display the $sign in front of this amount. And for that, we can wrap this with single quotes. But now this would all be treated as text. And therefore, I'll instead use this injection syntax, which I've shown you before in the course, with the $symbol, which now won't be displayed as a $symbol, but which instead tells Dart that we want to inject a value into this string. But here the value is actually the result of a more complex expression instead of a single variable. And therefore here you actually have to extend this syntax and add an opening curly brace and at the end a closing curly brace. And this simply tells Dart that it should take this value here as one value that should be injected into this string. Now, as I mentioned, I want to output a $sign in front of this string, and this $sign won't be output. Instead, that belongs to Dart. If I do want to output a $sign, I instead have to escape that character, as it's called, by adding a backward slash in front of this special $sign here. This backward slash now won't be output. Instead, this now tells Dart that this $sign after the backward slash should be output as text and should not be treated as this special injection syntax. So here we won't see 2 $signs on the screen, but instead this second $sign belongs to this injection syntax, and this first $sign will be output because we're escaping it, as it's called. And with that, we should display this amount below the title. Indeed, if we save this, we should already be able to see this. Of course, we'll soon make sure that the title won't be centered anymore, but in general, this doesn't look too bad. We have the title, we have the amount, and we have this $sign in front of the amount. Now, we're still not done with the expense item widget here, though. We're now outputting the title and the amount, but there's more information that should be output. In this row here, so in the same row as we're outputting the amount, I also want to output information about the category and the date. And for this, I'll add a row inside of this row because I want to group category and date together. They should be output next to each other, but they should be pushed all the way to the right in this card here. So the amount should stay on the left and the other information, the other 2 items, should be displayed next to each other horizontally, but pushed to the right. Hence, we have to put them into a separate collection, you could say, a separate group of widgets. And since I want to output category and date next to each other horizontally, I will group them together with row. But I'm doing this so that between this amount text and this row, I can add another widget, and that will be the special spacer widget, which is also built into Flutter and which can be created with const. Spacer is simply a widget that can be used in any column or row to tell Flutter that it should create a widget that takes up all the space it can get between the other widget, between which it is placed. So text gets all the space it needs to output the text, and this row will get all the space it needs to output its child items, but spacer then will always take all the remaining space, hence pushing text to the left and this to the right. And now with that, we of course can and should add children to that inner row. And here we now want to have this category or this icon that represents the category and then next to it the date. Now for the icon, we can use the built-in icon widget, which can be used for displaying an icon. And for the moment, I'll just use a dummy icon here. We'll soon use a dynamic icon, which will depend on the category. For the moment, I'll just use any icon here, like for example, let's say the alarm icon. And then next to that, I'll add a sized box to add some distance between this icon and the date, with a width of 8, for example. And next to that, I have my text that should output the date. And we can also add const here, though that will soon change, since soon this won't be a hard-coded dummy icon anymore. But for the moment, it can be const. But now for this text here, I want to output the date of my expense. And for that, we can of course access expense date, but this would be of type datetime, not of type string, and it also wouldn't be formatted at all. Now we'll soon take care of formatting. For the moment, we'll just convert it to a string by calling toString. This will make sure that the date will be output as a text date. Well, and with all of that, if you save this, you should see all this information on the screen. You see the title here, you see the amount, and of course you also see this icon for the category and then next to it the date, which looks ugly as mentioned because it's not formatted at all. And indeed, that's the next thing we'll take care of. We'll make sure that the icon is actually chosen dynamically, that it depends on the category of the expense, and we'll make sure that the date is formatted in a more human-readable way.